Well, we've seen how what today is known as the non-subscribing Presbyterian Church of Ireland has its roots in the early 18th century in a struggle within Presbyterianism over the place of reason and the seat of authority in religion. But it's not just a quarrel between congregations or personalities within a few churches in the northeast of Ireland. It's really part of a European-wide movement, part of the beginning of what came to be called the Enlightenment. But it's a new kind of struggle because it's a struggle for allowing differences, allowing different opinions, different thoughts, different ways of thinking. Now, in this day and age, we usually, or we should, respect different opinions and make allowances for different ways of understanding. But this was a novelty in the early 18th century. This was something that didn't happen in many places at all. And so different churches, different ecclesiastical structures met these challenges in different ways. So let's have a look at what happened and what happened in Ireland. And let's look too at what lies behind some of the challenges between different opinions. Because what many people were scared of was what they called heresy. Is heresy behind what's going on? Let's have a look at the story. Now, heresy is very much a loaded term in the 21st century, in modern times, generally. And it's not one that's employed anymore in academic circles. And the division between heresy and orthodoxy often really depends on your point of view. And often a heretic is just someone with whom you disagree. And the tendency through Christian history is that when there have been periods of theological controversy, the victors in that controversy term themselves orthodox, and the losers are the heretics. At certain times, some people have rejoiced in the title of heretic. And Sir John Campbell, the notable layperson who more than anyone else was responsible for creating the non-subscribing Presbyterian Church in 1910, who also wrote the first history of the denomination. He took the view that heretic was a title of honour, and he regarded Martin Luther as not the first, but one in a series of important heretics who challenged orthodoxy and brought in a new era of truth. He wrote, "The history of the heretic makes sad reading, sad because of his personal sufferings, and sadder still from the fact that his efforts to clarify religion and promote morality have been so bitterly opposed by the religious organizations with which he had been brought into conflict. We owe our Protestantism to a man who dared to be a heretic and to choose opinions which the orthodoxy of his time condemned." And this is strident language, but there is a lot of truth in this. It's a narrow divide that produces heresy on one side and orthodoxy on the other. But even though our quarrel in Presbyterianism in Ireland in the 1720s that ends in 1725 or 1726 with the ejection of the Presbytery of Antrim from the Synod of Ulster, even though that is about authority, and as I've said, most theological divisions, in fact really all theological divisions, are about authority in religion. Though it's about authority, inevitably behind that quarrel lies suspicions of heresy. Now, our quarrels in Ireland relate to the place of the Westminster Confession of Faith. Should ministers and others be required to subscribe to it? Now, the Westminster Confession of Faith dates from 1646. And it clearly is predated by, obviously, by the Bible, by a whole lot of Christian history, and indeed by Presbyterianism itself. So Presbyterianism is not created by the Westminster Confession, it's the other way around. And when it is created in the 1640s, it is not used immediately as a method of ensuring orthodoxy. It is a book written to define and complete all that the Reformed faith is meant to include. But it's not made a compulsory document in Ireland until 1705, some years later. In that year, the Synod of Ulster votes unanimously to make subscription to the Westminster Confession of all new entrants to the ministry, to make subscription compulsory. All the ministers who'd been ordained prior to that, which really takes us back as a fully functioning denomination back really to the 1660s, all the previous ministers hadn't had to subscribe to the Westminster Confession of Faith. So why suddenly do they have to subscribe to this confession? Well, we have to go back to the very end of the 17th century and the start of the 18th century, and a Dublin minister called Thomas Emlyn. Now here is his portrait, quite a detailed and impressive engraving. And this portrait appears in Alexander Gordon's Historic Memorials of the First Presbyterian Congregation of Belfast. History of First Church, written by one of the ministers, who was also a tremendously important historian, the Rev Alexander Gordon, and written in the 1880s. Now, some people today would say that Thomas Emlyn is not important in the history and development of non-subscription. But Gordon certainly thought he was, because in his history of First Church, which is profusely illustrated, there are only 4 full-page portraits. It's a large book, and there are a lot of illustrations, but there are only 4 full-page portraits. And one is the famous William Bruce, who was minister of First Church. Another is the Reverend John Scott Porter, who in the 19th century was a very famous minister of First Church. One is a photograph of G.K. Smith, who was the secretary of the church at the time of the publication. And the sole other full-page portrait is this of Thomas Emlyn. And Emlyn was important in the development of non-subscription, although not in a direct way. So who was Thomas Emlyn? Well, he was born in England, in Lincolnshire, into a dissenting family, and he trained for the dissenting ministry. Although he had some links, he always maintained some links with the established church. But he became quite a prominent minister, and certainly occupied quite a privileged position, because in 1683 he became domestic chaplain to the Countess of Donegal. She had a house in London, but obviously also was connected to the family in Belfast. And he accompanied her to Belfast in 1684 and continued as her chaplain after she remarried following the death of her first husband. So in Belfast, Thomas Emlyn becomes established, but he certainly isn't the minister of First Church, and he isn't really a Presbyterian at this point, because he's given special dispensation to preach in Belfast Castle, and was on close terms with the Anglican establishment. He was given a preaching license. He was in a privileged position as a Presbyterian, because one of the things to remember at this time is that Presbyterians generally did not have full religious and political rights, and that's another issue that will come up as we go along with our story. So Thomas Emlyn is in Belfast in the 1680s. He's in quite a privileged financial position. He's in quite a privileged religious position. His engagement ends in 1688, which is quite a troubled time anyway, and he has to go back to England. He declines an offer to go to Dublin. But about 2 years later, that offer is renewed to be the co-minister of Wood Street in Dublin. This is to work as the colleague to the Reverend Joseph Boyce. So Thomas Emlyn goes to be minister in Dublin, and he's a popular, well-regarded preacher. He's a significant figure in Dublin life, as indeed is Joseph Boyce. Indeed, we might digress for a moment just to think about Joseph Boyce, who was minister in Dublin at Wood Street. He'd arrived there a little bit earlier I think in about 1683 as the co-minister or junior minister alongside the famous Dr. Daniel Williams, who established the famous dissenting library in London. But Joseph Boyce was English. He was born in Leeds, although his father had been a Puritan who had been born in New England and lived in Boston before returning to England. He was a Puritan who had was part of that exodus, or whose family was part of that exodus to New England. And Dr. Godfrey Brown, who writes the entry on Joseph Boyce in the dictionary, in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, refers to him as displaying or exhibiting kind of liberal Puritanism. And there's probably a lot of truth in that. But Boyce was very important because the Wood Street congregation was really, because it was in Dublin and because it included many important people, it was the most important Presbyterian congregation in Ireland, in the capital city. And Boyce had the ear of a lot of important people, and he was referred to by contemporaries as the great Mr. Boyce. He was a very important proponent of Presbyterian rights who went into pamphlet controversy with leaders of the Church of Ireland, made the case for Presbyterian rights. And he was also influential amongst the ministry, not just in Dublin, but across the whole of Ireland. And for instance, it was through his contacts that a man called Thomas Jackson became minister of Downpatrick in 1700. And Thomas Jackson also came from Leeds, from the congregation that is today Mill Hill Chapel. And it shows the connection between liberal-minded, liberal Puritan ministers in Ireland and England. And Joseph Boyce, as the premier Dublin minister, also led the Dublin and many of the Synod of Munster congregations in coming out in favour of the non-subscribers when the controversy broke in the 1720s. But Thomas Emlyn, because of his abilities and because of his social connections and his background, makes an ideal co-minister in Dublin for Joseph Boyce. Thomas Emlyn begins to be suspected of heresy. Now, for people to be claimed to be heretics, you need to have heresy hunters. And throughout this period, there's often less evidence of, in inverted commas, heresy, but just plenty of people who set themselves up as heresy hunters. And in this case, in Dublin, the heresy hunter is a man called Duncan Cumming, an elder of the congregation who had been educated for the ministry, and I think he was a doctor. But Duncan Cumming listened to sermons very carefully, and after Thomas Emlyn had been there for about 12 years, he noticed not things that he was saying that he thought were theologically questionable, but he noticed omissions in Emlyn's preaching. And alongside Joseph Boyce interviewed him. This would be in 1702. Now, generally, those who thought they could sniff out heresy in this early 18th century period of Presbyterianism were not necessarily that admirable. But in this case, Duncan Cumming, in observing these omissions, had hit the nail on the head, and Thomas Emlyn had moved to a position on the doctrine of the Trinity which would have been regarded as unacceptable in terms of the Westminster Confession. So when he was interviewed, he owned up to not holding to entirely orthodox doctrines on the Trinity and offered to resign. Now, the doctrine that Thomas Emlyn held to was what was known as Aryanism. Now, Aryanism is named after a 3rd or 4th century theologian called Arius. And Arius basically put forward a point of view of the nature of the relationship between Christ and God. Basically, that Christ was subordinate to God the Father. And this is all bound up with the notion of the Trinity and with the person and work of Christ as well. And it becomes very abstruse, but in the year 325, the Council of Nicaea saw this conflict between Arianism and Athanasianism, and the Arians were defeated, and Arianism became officially regarded as heresy within the church, and the Nicene Creed was created to set out how people were supposed to understand the relationship between the different persons of the Godhead. But Arianism emerges again in the late 17th, early 18th century. And one of the reasons it comes to the fore is because of this renewed emphasis on the Bible as the religion of Protestantism, and as the Bible being its own interpreter and being all that you needed to connect with God. The thing was, if you read the Bible without reference to the history of the church in terms of its creeds and confessions, if you read the Bible and look for your own doctrines there, on something like the doctrine of the Trinity, well, basically the doctrine of the Trinity is not there. Now, this is controversial and people will disagree with me, but I think basically if you read the Bible separated from the historical teachings of the church, there is no fully formed doctrine of the Trinity to be found. And certainly what people found in the early 18th century, often when they read the Bible directly, was that the person of Christ was exalted, but was not the same as God. And so Arianism starts to become an idea that is passed around between people. Now, it doesn't go very far in Ireland. It emerges with Thomas Emlyn, who, having been discovered to be an Arian, then goes on to publish later in life a series of defenses of Arian views. But as we'll see, he's punished very heavily for his departure from orthodoxy. But Arianism becomes a constant bogeyman for early 18th century dissenters, not just in Ireland, but in England as well. And ironically, what provokes this is, perhaps in some ways inevitably, the writing of an Anglican. This was the Reverend Samuel Clarke, and we will look at him and the story of Thomas Emlyn in our next film.